everybody. Welcome to our March monthly forum for the Acadiana Press Club. I'm Ian Ozan, the Vice President of the Press Club. Thank you for joining us here. For those of you watching on the Acadiana Open channel, thank you for joining us on TV and spending some time with us. Today we're talking about the legislative forum, the big cluster, for lack of a better phrase, that was the special legislative session to deal with the budget. Still a $70+ million deficit for the current fiscal year, $750 million deficit for next fiscal year. We'll be talking about how we got here and what Louisiana can do to fix the problem. Today, joined by four panelists, starting on my left, Mr. Jan Muller. I did get that right, correct?
I did.
Jan Muller with the Louisiana Budget Project. Mr. Jason Alcubing with One Acadiana, formerly the Greater Lafayette Chamber of Commerce. Robert Scott with the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. And Dawn Starnes. Now, Dawn, forgive me, I forget your title.
State Director of NFIB.
State Director of NFIB, National Federation of Industry and Business?
Independent Business.
Independent Business. And they're here today to talk about, again, the budget, how it affects businesses, and how it affects you, the Louisiana citizen. We'll go ahead, start with you, Dawn, opening statements for about 2 minutes, or Robert, do you want to get started?
I've been elected by the committee here to start out.
This is the
Appreciate
first
it.
time in the 2 or so years we've been doing this that someone's been elected to give the opening statement, so go ahead.
Yeah, and listen, it is good to be here, and I'm really pleased to see a good turnout at the press club here. I hope I can come back sometime. It looks like a great group. Haven't had a chance to meet all of you, but certainly would want to before you take off. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council. We're known as PAR. Been around since 1950. One of the more popular things we do is we put out a legislative guide every year to the members of the legislature, and it has a lot of other information about state government in there. It's really quite popular, and I brought copies, only I'm running out. So those of you who want one, just come up and get one after you're done, and that'll about use them up. If you need one, just email me, and we'll be glad to send one free to the media. But we have a PAR app too, if you don't mind me making a quick plug.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have a PAR app. If you just go on either Android device or Apple device, go to your app store and look for PAR Guide, and then download it. It's absolutely free, and it contains a lot of the information that you find here. Well, we just had a special session, and it was total chaos and a mess at the very end, I think, as most of you probably heard or saw. And it wasn't that different from what happens in a lot of sessions. For example, last year, when they were having a revenue-raising session, and at their regular spring session, at the last minute, they passed just hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bills that were coming out of the conference committees, and the people voting on them didn't know what was in them, and there was this huge rush at the end, and everybody was in panic. But since the bell was going to go off and they had to adjourn, people's backs were against the wall, so they just passed them out. And I like to describe this thing as kind of like when you're going fishing, and it looks like chaos if you're a bait fish out there and the predator fish are coming at you, right? Because those last minutes, everything's just going crazy. But if you're a predator fish, then everything is going exactly according to plan. And that's basically what happened last year. There were a lot of people who wanted to push through a lot of measures. They saved everything to the end, threw it at everybody, and the predators ended up getting more or less what they wanted. This year in the special session, you had sort of the same looking chaos, but I don't think anybody really knew for sure what was in a lot of those bills. Certainly there was no single person anywhere in the Capitol who knew everything that was going on. You had a lot of chaos at the end simply because they were disorganized and they just didn't do a very good job this time around. But a lot of pretty big things happened all the same in the special session. For one, we now have in Louisiana the highest combined sales tax in the country of any state. We were at like 9 cents on average across the parishes in the state with the combined local and state sales tax. Now we're number one. We're number one in something in Louisiana, and that's the highest sales tax. We've taken over Tennessee for the top spot. And maybe that wouldn't be so bad, except we also have an income tax, and Tennessee really doesn't have an income tax except on interest earnings. The other big thing that came out of this is they set up a kind of fiscal cliff that's coming in July 2018. The sales tax bills, all of the exemptions they took off of the sales taxes, and all of the bills they passed last year, which sort of took a slice out of all of the credits and exemptions and rebates that companies in Louisiana take, those are all coming back and all of it sunsetting at the end of the next 2 fiscal years from now. And so in July 2018, we'll have a big fiscal cliff of probably more than $1.5 billion. And so that may force everybody to start having a very serious conversation very soon about how we're going to deal with that, either on the budget side or how we're going to reorient our revenue to see how we're going to fix that. In fact, there's already a lot of talk about having a second special session, maybe as soon as the end of this, maybe as soon as June, right after our regular session. We'll see if that comes about. One of the other really big things that happened in the special session is they went out and just got rid of a bunch of these sales tax exemptions. And PAR has said for a long time that it might help our tax base if we got rid of a lot of these sales tax exemptions. Now realize a lot of these sales tax exemptions are like for food, and they're protected in the Constitution, prescription drugs, your residential utilities. These are things that they didn't get rid of because they're protected in the Constitution. So we have a lot of sales tax exemptions that are tied up in things that are actually very popular, and there aren't very many people who want to get rid of those. But there's a whole lot more sales tax exemptions that they ought to be looking at and targeting. In fact, the Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Committee today on the Senate side is starting to go through those sales tax exemptions one by one and starting to sort through them and looking for maybe a permanent solution of getting rid of or keeping some of those sales tax exemptions. In the meantime, they passed these bills that just wholesale got rid of large groups of these. And I think this is really significant because before all of these special breaks that were being handed out, the legislature would have had to come and had to take the action of getting rid of those one at a time. Now, the businesses or the special interests are going to have to come back and climb back into the game and rather than just defending it. And I think that changes the whole chemistry. However, 2 years from now, all of those could go away on that fiscal cliff. Finally, just a couple more things. We had a big change in the corporate income tax. Actually, it hasn't changed yet. It's going to be up to the voters in the fall to decide whether or not they're going to set a trigger that will allow a flat tax for corporate income tax. Basically, what the voters will be voting on in the fall is whether or not to allow corporations on their corporate income tax forms to no longer take their federal taxes as a deduction. If they no longer take that federal tax as a deduction, what will happen is these other laws will kick in and will actually bring down the upper rate of corporate income tax, which is now at 8%, down to 6.5%. That's the whole mechanism that would be put into place. And by and large, it might raise just a little bit more money as best we can tell through the Legislative Fiscal Office analysis of it. But the main point is to bring that rate down so that we appear more competitive on a regional basis. And you have to go a long way. You have to go to Maryland and Iowa and California to get a rate, as high as 8% for your top rate. So a lot of organizations have thought that this would be a good idea. The Tax Foundation, the Committee 100 did a report suggesting this, and Jim Richardson, who is an economist at LSU, who did a study for the legislature, also made a similar recommendation. And so we'll be watching this to see how this plays out, but the voters will have a say in that. Finally, and I'd be glad to talk more about this later, I think one mistake that they made in this, I think there's a lot of exemptions that is probably a good idea to go after on sales tax, but they shouldn't have gone after the manufacturing, machinery, and equipment sales exemption. This is basically a tax on investment, and this rather than a tax on an end product or a tax on a service. And I think it was a real mistake because when companies make a capital investment, when manufacturers make a capital investment, they're basically looking for what return on investment they can get with the money that they're spending. And really just a few percentage points might make all the difference. So we call it the MM&E, the manufacturing machinery equipment. It was Governor Blanco who had really, I think, a mandate from the public when she was elected, who brought that tax change to the state and make it more beneficial, make the state more competitive. So I think they made a mistake with that one, but plenty more to say, but I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the team now to continue. Who's going to go next? Jan, you going up next?
It's Dawn, do you want to go next? Or?
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
For me, y'all moderate yourselves.
Thank you to the Press Club for inviting me. Again, we're the Louisiana Budget Project. We look at state and budget issues with a particular eye on how they affect low and moderate income families in Louisiana. And I think the past special session was very disappointing in many ways. The legislature had 3 jobs to do in a very short amount of time. And granted, they were 3 very difficult jobs. Number one, they had to rebalance the current year budget, which had a shortfall of about $950 million. Secondly, they had to deal with next year's budget, which had a gap of about $2 billion between the revenue coming in and the expenses needed to just keep state government going at its current level. And number 3, they had to fix the structural problems in the state budget. You know, we've been going along for years now, not really paying for the government we use every year. We've been paying for about 90–95% of our government with recurring tax revenue and making up the difference with one-time money or whatever kind of little trick the state could come up with. So they had 3 different problems to solve, very short time to do it. They went 0 for 3. The closest they came was really in filling the current year, the mid-year budget gap, which was the most serious because you had such little time left in the fiscal year. While taxes were a part of this, let's just look at exactly what they did. They used $328 million in one-time revenue, actually a little bit more than that. That was $200 million in BP settlement dollars, $128 million from the rainy day fund. They raised $302 million in new taxes just from April 1st through the end of the year. Most of that, as Robert said, are temporary. They're coming off the books in a couple of years. Some of them are recurring, like the cigarette tax and the beer tax and a couple of others, but most of this are temporary taxes that are coming off the books. They raised about $80 million by refinancing some bonds, which basically gets the state short-term money, but is going to cost us more in the long term through bond refinancing. And they made about $160 million in actual budget cuts. And in those cuts, we also include money that state agencies were expecting to spend, but that they have to absorb. That was the case with TOPS, for example. Universities were expecting to get $28 million more for TOPS scholarships than they're actually getting this year. And when you did all this, they were still $70 million short of balancing this year's budget. So we're going to find out today or sometime this week what new cuts are in store for state government after the legislature failed to do its job. We also have another $750 million gap in next year's budget, the budget that they have to build this spring for the year starting July 1st. And we're going to find out in the next weeks what kind of cuts are in store for programs there. I think one thing that's very important to remember when we talk about cuts, because there's this sense that state government is this bloated beast and we just need to cut it down to size and it's all we have is a spending problem. We've been cutting this budget for the last 7 years. And we've cut it to a place where a lot of agencies can't sustain many more cuts. It was a very interesting exercise in the first week of the special session. The Ways and Means Committee was hearing testimony on all the tax proposals, and right next door, the Appropriations Committee was hearing testimony from state agencies about the budget. And I think a lot of legislators had come in thinking, well, we can cut our way to a balanced budget. And once they heard from those agencies, they realized that there was no getting out of this without raising revenues in some form or fashion. The example I like to use is the Department of Children and Family Services. The head of that agency was somebody who had been in state government as a deputy secretary up until 8 years ago, and she came back to lead the department this time, and the department has almost been cut in half. And she came in and she told legislators, look, we don't have enough money if you make these cuts to provide, to investigate cases of child abuse. And so I think no matter what you feel about the role of government, and I'm sure there is fat in every department somewhere, but I think everybody would agree that it is a very legitimate role of state government to investigate cases of child abuse, children who are being abused and neglected. That's not something you privatize or contract out. That's something state government has to do, and we're in danger of not being able to do that as a state because we've cut our budget so much in recent years. Again, by making these tax increases temporary, the legislature guaranteed that we're going to be back at the table talking about this, and hopefully we'll be talking about these structural changes. As Robert mentioned, and I'm going to steal a line from Jim Richardson, the LSU economist, when you look at where the state gets its revenue, we get revenue from a lot of different areas, but most of it comes from two sources: sales taxes and personal income taxes. After the legislature's action this spring, we are more or less maxed out on sales tax. We are now the highest sales tax in the country. We may not be after it falls off the books in a year or so, but we're 39th in personal income tax collections per capita. If we're going to fix our structural budget problems, at some point we're going to have to get serious about raising revenues, not in a temporary fashion, but in a more permanent way that provides enough money to fund the government that we have today, let alone make new investments in children and families and higher education and recover some of what was lost. And the way to do that, frankly, is to look at personal income taxes. There were some very good ideas put out in the special session that I'd be happy to talk about more. They just didn't get enough votes. They didn't get close to the 2/3 majority that's needed to move forward. But there are some ways to fix this. Obviously, we should still keep looking for cuts where appropriate, but I think the state, what's become clear to me at least, is that we have a revenue problem in state government, and it's a revenue problem that's not going away, and it's one that they're going to have to look at. If not this June, they're going to be looking at it next spring when they come back for a fiscal session next year, and hopefully there will be some real attention paid to the structural changes that are needed.
Jason?
Yeah, I'll try to build on some of the comments that Robert and Jan have shared. It's great to be here. Thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm the president and CEO of One Acadiana, which is a business-led, business-funded organization here in Lafayette. We focus on making a 9-parish region as strong and as competitive, sustainable, and prosperous as possible. As we were looking at the issues that would be debated in the special session, we brought together our group of leaders for a conversation about, what should be the real principles and priorities of the special session. How should we guide our efforts to try to influence the outcome of what's being debated at the Capitol? And I'll just summarize a few of the things that came out of that conversation. And I should add that this is not just business leaders, but several civic leaders here in the Lafayette area. First of all, there was a lot of focus on the need to build a long-term foundation for stability and sustainability in the state's fiscal structure. There was some concern about raising taxes, as you might expect from a business organization, but I would say that there was equal concern about what the impacts of budget cuts to institutions like UL Lafayette and SLCC and to the hospital partnership would be. In particular, with the downturn in the oil field and its both direct and indirect impacts, there was concern that major state budget cuts would exacerbate the local economic conditions in a way that would really impact our economic development. And so there was a willingness, I think, to make what some would call courageous votes. But there was also, I think, a deep desire to see a commitment emerge from this special session to putting the spending side of government on a more sustainable basis through practices like better debt management, giving more autonomy to our higher education institutions, reforming state retirement systems for new people coming on board, looking at ways to control the spending in the judicial and the legislative branches, giving local government more autonomy. And as we were having that discussion, I think there was also a recognition that while we were debating principles and priorities and taking a longer-term view, that many of the implications of that conversation were things that would be very difficult to implement in crisis mode. There was a recognition that we had, as I think Jan described it, three very difficult jobs that he laid out. All of those, solving any one of those challenges is much more complex than having a conversation about a shared sacrifice, or how much should business do versus individuals, or how much of it should be done in cuts versus tax increases. And I think there was a real concern that we were dealing with a crisis with very little time in our government institutions to actually prepare for it, with a governor who had just recently come off a campaign, first-time governor who was still building his team at the time that these fiscal challenges were staring us in the face, and a legislature that included a lot of folks who would be casting their votes for the very first time on some of the most difficult issues that our state had confronted in the modern era. As we look at how the legislature came out on these priorities, things like achieving long-term fiscal sustainability and stability, adequately funding key priorities like K through 12 and higher education, healthcare, transportation infrastructure, economic development, moving towards a growth-oriented tax system, providing greater autonomy to local governments. I would say that on all of those measures, the outcomes so far have been pretty disappointing. I would also add that I think as we go forward, it's going to be particularly important to have a real debate around what ought to be the right principles and priorities for our state government going forward. Is it important that we are among the lowest tax yield states in the country? Is it important that we're economically competitive for certain sectors? Is it important that we have a progressive tax code for individuals at different income levels? Those are all, I think, important debates to have. I think that that our likelihood of getting to a coherent tax system that's based on a real strategy will be much greater if we have a real debate in our state about what sort of principles and priorities should our tax system be based on, and then make the tax code live up to that. So I'm excited to have that discussion. I hope that conversation can begin today at this press club.
I'm Dawn Starnes. I'm the state director for the National Federation of Independent Business here in Louisiana. We represent over 4,000 small business owners across Louisiana in every industry segment, and every size, from 1 person to 50 people up to we have some companies who are members who are 300 or more. Started out as little baby companies and grew. To Jason's point about crisis, certainly no one makes a good decision in crisis mode, and the state is certainly in that. And I think that where we are as an organization representing small business who gets hit at every level, every time you talk about corporate income, personal income, taxes, all of it, they hit them every time. And so where we are is that we want to be out of crisis mode. We want these legislators to get out of this mode. And over the special session, we actually supported a concept that front-loaded the sales tax, where it was tapered off. It had a back down date, and it had a tapering off, because it would have, over the long term, saved taxpayers and would have truly held the feet to the fire for the legislators and the governor. Fortunately, they did put the 27 months in there on the sales tax, and we feel like that will help hold their feet to the fire, but obviously it didn't fix the problem. And where we are is that, there's an argument that, sales tax is regressive. Well, everything's regressive here right now, and we are not competitive as a state. We're in a bad way. And so to say that you don't want to up the sales tax a quarter of a cent more, 1.25% as opposed to 1, is a little short-sighted, I think, because you have to pay for the services that are needed, and you have to pay for the cost of running government, and you have to do these things. And so how are you going to go about it? And to Han's point, the budget can be cut some more in some areas, and so that talking point on Department of Social Services always gets me a little bit fired up, because I think that that's certainly a touch point for a lot of people. Nobody wants to hear that a child case isn't going to be investigated, and that is the role of government. But there are places like Medicaid, big behemoth programs within government. Some of the incentive programs, and to not be at odds with my good friend Jason here, but I had a conversation, I just left the Capitol with some economic development folks, and in a conversation with Representative Schroeder about a bill he has to do some things with the programs. All of these programs have to be looked at. And before you come back to small business owners and ask for more taxes, because we pay 50% of the sales tax anyway, it doesn't just land on individuals. So business is paying 50% roughly, and individuals are paying 50% roughly. I think the numbers are 53 and 47. But the point is that you have to, before you come back and say, let's do that, we have to look at these big program areas, and don't single out children who are not getting investigated. That's not right. Let's talk about the big problems in state government. And that's our concern is that, and there are many, there are several. Healthcare needs to have some reforms to it. TOPS needs to have some reforms to it. The things that are costing the state money need to have reforms, and it's time to have that conversation. And so it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but just small business owners have to plan, they have to budget, they have to be able to adapt to their surroundings, and the expectation is that state government should be able to do the same thing, because taxpayer dollars are funding state government. And so we want to hold our legislators and our governor accountable to these things, and certainly feel very much under attack in the sense of all of the taxes that are being proposed, and all of these things. So we've had to be on the defense a lot the past 3 weeks. I'm quite tired, but I know the legislators are tired of seeing me, so I was glad to run away to Lafayette for lunch. But they have, there's a lot on their plates. They're making tough decisions as well. But as we move into this regular session, the fact that we're even talking about things like a minimum wage increase, and mandated paid sick leave, and all these other additional burdens that this governor wants to put on small business is a little upsetting, concerning, and disconcerting to position the state in such a way. So we're working very hard on behalf of our members to be sure that folks understand what they're doing, how it impacts a small business owner, because things like the personal income tax piece, one of the proposals actually had, thankfully didn't go through, but one of them looked like about a 17 to 25% increase on people who make it anywhere from $50,000 to $110,000. That was the bracket. When some of you start to look at some of these bracket changes and things and where it went up, those were some of the numbers. And so that hits a small business owner pretty hard, because most small business owners are truly in that ballpark. There are some who obviously do better. But to the point of when you start to look at personal income tax, you would have to really take a look at that, because corporate income tax doesn't really affect a lot of small business owners. They file as individuals, and they pass through organizations. So The tax code is very complex. To give you just a little stat, small business owner pays 67% higher cost to comply with tax code here in the state and federally because of how complex it is, and because they don't have the wherewithal that a large corporation has to go out and hire, a myriad of people. They still have to hire those people, but they don't have the, kind of the economies of scale, I guess you would say. So anyway, that's for us, I guess we're happy to have a seat at the table in the conversations with the legislators, with the governor, with our colleagues at the Capitol to say, okay, where is the right fit? We know that everybody, as Senator Alario told me at the beginning of the special session, everybody's going to take a little haircut and we're going to be okay. And of course he ended up saying at the end of the session, he wasn't real happy with where we were. So, there's a lot of work still left to do. We hope to get out of this regular session with not too much more burden put on small business owners and get back to the business of figuring out how to plug the hole that we have and make the reforms so we don't end up here again. That's our biggest thing on anything we do tax-wise increase. It should have a sunset on it. It should have a phase out, because we need to hold legislators and the governor accountable for these taxes that they are raising that hit everybody. So you should want it to have a sunset. You should want it to have a phase out, but not so that we end up in a fiscal cliff situation. Policy guys might disagree with me, but so that we are getting some accountability and forcing a decision and a discussion to happen. As John Schroeder said this morning, put a gun to their head about it. So.
And that's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah.
The fact that there is a fiscal cliff. I'm saying what you're saying, is that it forces everybody to come back to the table and maybe do structural changes.
Yep.
I agree with you.
And since Robert is probably too modest to do it, I ought to compliment and recommend the excellent PAR report on
it was very
controlling
good.
state spending that you guys put out right before the beginning of the special session. A lot of the ideas that we considered were drawn directly from that report, and I think it's a good example of PAR's relevance to the work that economic development organizations and many others do.
Well, thank you very much.
The question I have after hearing everybody speak, and Dawn, you mentioned everybody would have to take a hit, businesses being hit hard enough, the individual taxpayer, the individual resident would have to take a hit. Jan, correct me if I'm wrong here, about 10, 12 years ago, the Stelling tax plan was passed, gave the state some sort of framework for which taxes were collected, a sales tax, but still taxes collected. It was repealed shortly after Governor Jindal took office. Tax cuts came afterward. Business tax cuts came afterward in the form of incentives, but there was nothing there to replace the Stelling tax, and as a result, the state wound up falling into this hole. Is that Cliff Notes version correct?
Yeah, and I think there was kind of some neat symmetry. You brought up Stelly, and Stelly was something, of course, that the voters of this state approved in 2002. They took away the state sales tax on food, drugs, and residential utilities, and in exchange, they raised personal income taxes on moderate and high-income households, and they did it by taking away excess federal itemized deductions and by narrowing the brackets so that the top rate kicked in a little sooner than it did before. And it was always designed to be kind of revenue neutral in year one, but then to grow with the economy better than the old system was growing, and it was working. And then, of course, in 2007, we had $1 billion surplus in state government, and so they restored the excess itemized deductions. They actually went a little further than the law was pre-Stelly. And then in 2008, we had another $1 billion surplus, and they restored the income tax brackets. Those two income tax cuts passed in 2007 and 2008 took a little bit more than $800 million out of the state tax base. And we never replaced that. And as an example of that, I would refer you to the current year budget, which has $826 million in one-time revenue. So, which is almost the exact amount that we took out of the tax base with Stelly. That's not the only reason the budget is in a ditch. I think there are really two reasons. One would be the mismanagement of the budget over the last 8 years. The second half would be the decline in energy prices and the ripple effects that's had throughout the economy on personal income tax collections, corporate income tax collections, and the like. But certainly, I think from our perspective, the original sin was making $800 million in income tax cuts in '07 and '08, and never really adjusting the state budget to pay for those cuts. I understand why they did it. I was covering the legislature at the time, and there was a lot more money in state government than the state knew what to do with. This was after Katrina, obviously, when the economy was kind of overheated, and it was very difficult for a legislator to go home and say, well, I have $1 billion surplus, and I didn't do anything to give some of that money back to the people who paid the taxes. So I completely understand why it was done, but in retrospect, obviously, it was a mistake, and it's one of the reasons it's been so hard to keep the budget balanced these last 8 years.
And I bring Skelly up because in this day and age, with people complaining that government has its hand in people's pockets too deeply already, that government is too fat, that perception still is still around, and that government doesn't need to take any more of our tax dollars. How do you convince? How does business? How does government convince the individual resident that their taxes should be raised, that a Stelly should be put back in, or some other plan should be put in? Dawn, Jason, I'd love to hear your take on this. How can business and industry convince the average Louisianan that they have to pay more and maybe take a step back or turn the clock back 10, 15 years and go to what we used to have with regards to a tax structure?
Well, I'll start. I'm not sure that it's the primary role of business to explain to the public why they should pay more in taxes.
That's our job.
Yeah.
So I would challenge that part of the question, but I would say that we're all in it together, and it's important that we have a real conversation about how these pieces fit together, how wealth is generated, how it's distributed, how economic opportunity is managed as a state, and business has a real role to play in that. And I think that the political debate has become increasingly toxic. There is, I think, a tendency to pit business against other important state priorities, whether it's higher education or healthcare. This, business versus personal divide. I mean, at the end of the day, business cannot function without a high-quality workforce. It can't function without good infrastructure. On the other hand, business needs a reasonable tax and regulatory structure in which to operate competitively. And indeed, our public, our citizens need that in order to have meaningful job opportunities here in Louisiana. And so I think getting that balance right is important, and drawing those connections is important. And I think that's the voice and the perspective that I think everybody needs to bring to the table, including business.
Dawn?
I couldn't agree with Jason more. I think to his point on that balance, it's so right. I mean, small business owners are the job creators in Louisiana. I mean, your mom and pop shops, your locally owned businesses, your retailers, your restaurants, they are creating jobs in your community right now, today. They probably employ you. So, I mean, most newspapers are small business owners. So whenever you really think about this idea of pitting against, and I really had a lot of heartburn over the special session, seeing higher education lobbying for higher taxes and going after big business specifically to say hey, they need to pay more because we've got to have this funded. That gives you a lot of heartburn, because then you take that back and you say, as a small business owner or whatever it is, you're writing checks to whatever community fund, race run, jog, cakewalk, fair, whatever it is. It's a small business and big business always come to the table to support the communities that they are in across Louisiana. And so I would dare anybody to suggest there's probably not a big corporation here that hasn't done their due service on community relations. That's why they have a department about it, probably. And every small business owner has probably donated a free $25 gift card to this, that, or the other, or a necklace from their little shop to whatever auction for whatever person who's sick. That is the real world impact of what's happening when you start to say, okay, well, let's put the burden on business. You have to really think about what that then does and what the ripple effect of that is. And so we are all in it together, and it does need to be a balance. Because again, small business owners, big business, we need government services, as I always tell the legislature when we start to get in this conversation about the inventory tax credit, which makes me crazy. It's such a twisted way of government funding state government funding local government, and business is the middleman. We shouldn't be in it, but the bottom line is that we are, and so, we have this out here, and we don't want to take away from local government. That's not about that. We need roads, we need bridges, we need public safety, we need education. So, we are here, we're in this, we need this, but we also have to be reasonable about what we're asking business to shoulder. And so that's where, I very much agree that it is a balance, and we have to figure out, no, we shouldn't be convincing anybody that, higher ed shouldn't be convincing the legislature to vote for taxes, and business shouldn't be convincing individuals that they need to like it. Nobody's gonna like it. So, I think it's just about all coming to the table and having representation. I think that's an important group. We have a great cross section represented here, and I think my members are a great example of, we are individual people who lived in Louisiana their whole life, and paying their dues and trying to just own and operate a business, and not have government involved.
We'll go to the floor. We've got about 50 minutes left. We'll go to the floor to take questions from members of the working meeting and those who have joined us here today. Who wants to go first? Anybody? Bueller? Y'all really fast. Well, go ahead, Don.
Well, it's almost like it's a vicious cycle here that we got. Like a business will donate to a good fund, a piece of jewelry, but they also write it off as well. So there's that. But every time that there is a need for taxes or a need for things to get done, higher education, roads, all these things, we go after higher education. We say Medicare, we got to work with Medicare, Medicaid, the healthcare system, we got to cut that. So you don't want to raise minimum wage. So you've got somebody who you're hiring at this pump minimum wage we have, and then they don't get 40 hours a week because it's saving money. It's just up to 40, so they're not getting any benefits. And so then they get sick, or then you want to take away Medicare programs and healthcare programs for them to take care of themselves. We're just painting ourselves in a corner. And business isn't a business making money. And that's what they do, and God bless them. That's what we need. We all need money. But you can't, everything seems to come down on the people who aren't at this table or in this room. And that's the poor people, the hurting people of this state. And we're just going to dump on them all the time. And we're going to keep them stupid by cutting education. There's got to be a better way. Bite the bullet, take some taxes, and improve your business in the process. Everybody's sacrificing, everybody's suffering, and so let's do it together. Get this deli plan back. That worked perfect. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't know. It's always cut the poor people and cut education.
Let me make a couple of clarifications about where we are on that, and I think we could go through and probably find some programs that affect the poor that been cut. But you mentioned specifically Medicaid and education. What we've seen right now is that Medicaid actually is going to be expanding in the state. The governor's going to be doing the Medicaid expansion. We've seen a lot of money spent on the public-private partnerships in the various old charity hospital systems to try to serve the poor. I don't see a huge diminution so far in those services. In fact, I think the larger trend on healthcare for the poor is by and large one in which the state seems to be trying to do more, not less. It is endangered, and that could change. But I don't think it's a burden that's hit them, really that hard so far. I think we should probably find some Department of Family Services programs where we could find some real issues. On education, the governor has not cut K through 12 education. He's said that he would not. and that the state pays a very large share to education across the state. What you do find as a real strain on a lot of the education systems is the growing costs of the pensions and the payments that we have to make to the unfunded accrued liability. There are certain expenses that are built into all of the agencies that are continuing to escalate from year to year. The pension is one of those. The group health benefits for state employees and state employee retirees is something that has gotten more and more expensive every year. And these agencies and on the local school district level, they're having these must-pay costs year to year that even if they're staying flat in the amount of money that they're getting for revenue, they're being eaten up from the bottom. And that's what's happening to higher education. It's the same thing. They're sort of getting eaten up from the bottom with the extra expenses that are there. And that's why a lot of people talk about trying to hold down these really big, fat, escalating programs that we have in state government, the pensions, the group health program, and our debt. I don't think,
Pay into the pension?
and what I'm saying is, you can make the future expenses of these programs worse, and there are ways you can maybe make them a little bit better, and that's one of the things we need to keep an eye on while we're watching all the rest of this. And just one last thing about higher ed, if you want a giant statewide lobbying force, for whatever it is the governor wants, or for raising revenue, and then you threaten higher education, and you immediately get higher education officials throughout the state to go down to the Capitol and start campaigning for whatever it is they can do to try to spare their revenue. But I just took a little issue with, I think you're right, about the concern about the poor and young is very much in tune with that issue, and I'm sure it can address it. But I do think on those particular issues, the state's taken a lot of effort to try to protect those types of things. So.
Education funding is actually up 8%. Has not been cut even, it's higher ed, so you have to really look at the numbers when you start to drill down. And but I was looking at a report this morning that shows K through 12 education funding is actually up 8% over the past few years. So.
Yeah.
I would. I don't know the report that you were looking at, but one of the things they did on K through 12 is they froze the state's allocation to the MFP, the minimum foundation program. If you just and before 2009, there was an automatic 2.75% inflation factor built in because the cost of things go up year after year. If you just adjust the MFP per the number of students, because we have more students today than we did in 2008, and inflation, we're actually down about $500 on a per student basis from the start of the Jindal year. So I agree that K through 12 hasn't been hit nearly as much as other parts of the budget. And it's certainly been protected, and I agree completely with Robert on the pensions and certainly on Medicaid. The Medicaid budget has grown, and we are going to be expanding Medicaid as of July 1st, which I think is a hugely positive thing. Where we have seen huge cuts is in higher education, where we've essentially flipped the way we fund colleges. 8 years ago, about 2/3 of the money going into higher education came from state support. 1/3 was paid by tuition. Today, it's about 1/3 state support, 2/3 is paid by the students through tuition. And again, if that's the policy we want in this state, then maybe that's what it's going to be going forward. Governor Edwards has said during the campaign he wants to get to a 50-50 ratio. I don't think we'll ever get back to that 2/3. But on the issue of the poor, I think two things we have to keep in mind on our tax system in Louisiana. According to the Tax Foundation, who we disagree with a lot of their recommendations, they're more conservative than we are, they say Louisiana has the 3rd lowest combined state and local tax burden in the country. So for all of our problems here in the state, being overtaxed as a citizenry is not one of our problems. We have low taxes. Now, there may be some unnecessary complexity in some of our tax code, but we do not, as a whole, pay extremely high taxes. One of the reasons is we have the lowest residential property taxes in the country in Louisiana, and again, one of the lowest income taxes among the states that charge an income tax. And the second thing, we have a tax system that's upside down. The poor pay taxes at a higher rate than the rich in Louisiana. If you're in the bottom 40% of income earners, which means you are probably having some trouble paying your bills every month. If you're not technically below the federal poverty line, you're certainly in that near poor group that's having trouble meeting all your monthly expenses. If you're in that group, about 10% of your overall income goes to pay state and local taxes. If you're in the top 1%, where the median taxable income is about $1.3 million, a little over 4% of your total income goes to pay state and local taxes. Obviously, that millionaire is paying a lot more in actual taxes than the person making $18,000 a year working at Circle K, but as a percentage of their overall income, they are paying less than, again, the person who comes and cleans their house or washes their car.
But I think, you can always make the contrast between the top 1%, and you may make a valid point there, but I think what most people want, to try to focus on is what's happening to the middle class, what's happening to the medium-sized and small businesses, and how are they getting squeezed. And, as you look through various tax foundation, rankings there, it really kind of depends on who you are out there. And our tax system is so complex. It's really almost it's a gamesmanship type of situation where it depends on who you are and what type of business you're in and what type of incentives you can get, what type of credits and exemptions and so on. A company coming into this state sees a high tax rate, a very complex tax rate. It's not a very competitive situation, from a complexity standpoint coming in, and there are a lot of businesses that do get very squeezed in the middle. I don't think that in this past 3-week session, there was really an expectation by many people or even the governor that we were going to sort of restructure, our tax system. The house was on fire. And when the house is on fire, you're not thinking so much about renovation. Maybe you're thinking about how the fire can force us to do a renovation, and I think that's great. So now we have the job in front of us of how we're gonna renovate. And everybody's talking about it, everybody's thinking about it. We're at least to that stage. I'm not that optimistic that something good, long-term, positive will be done. But there is an effort going on, to try to do that. There's lots of new study commissions, I'm involved in another one, and Jan's gonna be, giving advice to that group. And we hope we can reach a place where we can have a new tax structure that's broad-based, is more fair probably than the system, that we have now. Because a lot of people talk about, let's build a new tax structure and let's try to make it revenue neutral from where we are now. But revenue neutral really should be thought of as just kind of a target for when you're readjusting your taxes, where you can end up sort of where you are now. But it doesn't necessarily bring you new revenue just to reform the tax structure. And I think that's one of the great tensions we have in this whole discussion as we go down the road, is we're going to restructure our taxes, but who's going to end up paying more and who's going to end up paying less? And overall, how much more revenue is the state going to get? Is that going to be enough? I think this governor has really targeted, exemptions and credits and whatnot. And I think if he follows through on that type of policy angle, I think he'll go a long way towards helping fix the problem. And that's part of what a tax restructuring, can do. Try to make a fair system and fewer exceptions.
We're running out of time. We'll take one question back here.
Was there any reason why they didn't address that during the special session?
Well, they did partly, but I'm almost glad they didn't. I really wasn't expecting them to, and the governor has said he wants everybody to come back and do a restructuring. I think their main issue was let's just raise tax. We were hoping they wouldn't do damage in the process to any long-term reforms. That was the main concern. But I think to take on this giant restructuring with a new administration, new people, and a new legislature with a lot of learning curve going on there, I think in 3 weeks, I think that was too much to ask. They did do some restructuring with the corporate income tax proposal that's on the ballot, but ideally you'd have that and a number of other things all going on at once as a package, and that's not what we had, and I really wasn't expecting it to come in that.
Yeah, and to the point, I mean, the timing, I mean, you have a couple other things on that. These programs are also, they're intricate, they have, and I think the good thing about so many new legislators, I will say, it's like a dicey double-edged sword with term limits and new ones, but you've got a fresh group of legislators who are eager to learn and eager to, open to change, open to hearing all sides. So, special interests get, killed in the media sometimes, and they sound like such terrible people, but really we're just representing different areas. And so legislators are actually open to learning what's happening in these different areas and how these programs work and what the return on investment is, and is the state getting the bang for the buck? And you really can't do that in 3 weeks. You really do need a time, and over the course of the next year, they're starting some of that now, and they'll do it over the year. One of the programs is the inventory tax credit. That's a great example that Senator Allen has put together a task force to study that and find a way to fix it over the next year, so that when we come back in the fiscal session in 17,
Yeah, I'm on that one
we
too.
can do that one. Me too. So I mean, it's kind of, you shouldn't have to do a task force for every one of these, but the committees are actually doing a great job of calling the different groups into the table, and saying, okay, explain this to us. Some of these have lawsuits associated with them, so they need to understand the intricacies of why there might be a sales tax exemption on something for the railroads, because there was a court decision that said you can't tax whatever they use because it's interstate commerce. Things like that. And I mean, it gets down into the weeds that, often get lost in translation, but.
Right.
Before we wrap it up, I want to ask Jan, you mentioned earlier that you had 3 suggestions for fixing the budget, and we've not gotten back to them.
Well,
If you could give us a Cliff Notes version, what are those 3 suggestions?
Well, I don't know if I have 3. I would say, start off, we need to look at personal income tax. A good place to start would frankly be with the package of bills that was introduced by Representative Walt Leger during the session, that would have done away with the federal income tax deduction. Louisiana is one of 3 states that allows full deductibility of federal income taxes. That one deduction alone is worth over $900 million a year. I think if you got rid of that deduction, and it's incredibly skewed towards the wealthiest taxpayers, if you got rid of that deduction, you could actually lower rates across the board and still come up with net revenue. The numbers that we got on the package that Representative Leger put out would be, you got rid of that one deduction and you lowered the existing brackets from 2%, 4%, and 6% to 1.5%, 3.5%, 5.5%, you would get the bottom 60% of taxpayers would actually see a net tax cut. The folks in that 60 to 80% bracket would come out basically neutral, and the folks in the top 15%, 20% would see an increase. But again,
That was Representative Stokes' package.
Yeah, that.
Stokes
no,
was-
yeah,
Stokes' tax was
flat
Representative
tax.
Leger's, no,
Yeah.
Representative Leger's proposal was a 17 to 20%
He was
increase
changing
on
the
the bracket
brackets.
that you're just talking about.
He was changing the
He had,
brackets.
well, no, he had one that
That
was.
bracket
The
changed.
Stokes
with
one
the
was the
increase
one
on the
moving
middle
through.
class.
Just Stokes one was the one moving through for what you're
But she
talking
went,
about.
she went flat tax.
She went flat
She
tax.
did, but she had the same package, is what
Yeah.
you're saying. Leger was changing the brackets.
But
So
but no, he also had one that was, I think
that one
anyway.
wasn't one moving through the process.
anyway, getting rid of the federal deduction and lowering rates, could get the state $350 million or more in new revenue a year, and again, get rid of a deduction where we're outliers. I think looking at tax credits and exemptions would be a good idea. We spend $180 million a year on film and TV production in Louisiana, and I think that would be, and most of that's 2/3 of it goes to one metropolitan area in the state. Almost none of it filters down to any area besides New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport. So that would be an area to look. I think inventory tax reform is a place you could look. And you could look at the industrial tax exemption would be another place where the state loses a lot of revenue. Actually, it's local governments that lose that revenue, but I think there would be some things you could do to reform that. And maybe rebalance the burden between local governments and the state.
I'll give the rest of the table an opportunity to respond before we close.
Go ahead. What-
Yeah,
go
I'll,
ahead.
I'll, I'll just make a couple of points. You know, in the interest of identifying some real principles and priorities, Dominic suggested a big one should be how our tax system bears on the poor. I would add that another one ought to be how our tax system impacts traded industry sectors. In other words, industry sectors that primarily sell to customers outside of the state, and that is industry sectors that bring wealth to our state, that help grow our economy. And I think it's particularly important to focus there for a couple of reasons. One is that those sectors tend to provide very good paying jobs with benefits that provide economic opportunities and lift people up the ladder. Secondly, because they do bring wealth into a state or a region like ours, which not only helps small businesses, but it helps the people, the families of that area. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, when it comes to why we ought to pay special attention to them, they have the ability to locate in multiple locations. In other words, whether they're located here in Louisiana versus Mississippi versus Texas, they can serve their customers